I had always believed that moving into a quiet, gated neighborhood would give me the peace I needed after years of working long shifts and dealing with city chaos. I bought this house for the calm mornings, the friendly nods from neighbors, and the promise of safety that came with living behind those heavy iron gates. When I first signed the papers, I walked around the property and felt proud. The yard was big enough to grow a garden, the house had just the right amount of space for me and my dog, and the garage was perfect for my tools and weekend projects. It felt like a place where I could finally slow down and breathe. But within 2 weeks of moving in, I learned that this neighborhood was not like the peaceful place I had imagined. It was controlled by an HOA that took its power way too seriously, and at the center of it all was a woman named Karen who acted like she owned every blade of grass on every lawn in the community. At first, I tried to play along with the HOA rules. I kept my grass trimmed, paid the dues, and stayed polite during their endless emails about paint color regulations and mailbox inspections. Karen was the kind of person who would stop her car in the middle of the street just to tell you that your trash can was 2 inches too close to the curb. I shrugged it off most days because I didn't want trouble, but she never missed an opportunity to remind me that we have standards here. I figured as long as I kept my head down and did what they wanted, they'd leave me alone. But the trouble didn't come from Karen herself, at least not at first. It came from her son. I didn't know much about him when I moved in, except that he was in his early 20s and still living with Karen. The neighbors whispered that he had been in trouble before, but I never paid much attention. The first time I saw him, he was speeding through the neighborhood on an ATV even though the HOA rule specifically said no off-road vehicles were allowed on the streets. Karen was standing in her driveway waving proudly as he passed by, completely ignoring the rules she enforced on everyone else. That was my first real clue that the HOA didn't apply to Karen or her family the way it applied to the rest of us. Still, I stayed out of it. I wasn't about to tell anyone how to parent their grown son or what vehicles they could ride. Things escalated one Saturday night when I came home late from a work trip. I unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and immediately noticed something was wrong. My living room lights were on even though I was sure I had turned them off before leaving. My heart started pounding as I carefully stepped inside and glanced around. There were muddy boot prints on my hardwood floor, leading straight to my kitchen. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter, every muscle in my body tense. When I turned the corner into the kitchen, I found Karen's son sitting at my kitchen island, drinking one of my beers from the fridge like he owned the place. He smirked when he saw me and said the words that would end up changing everything, "Relax, man. Mom runs the HOA. I can be here if I want." It took me a second to process what he had just said. He wasn't just trespassing, he was bragging about it, like he believed the HOA gave him a free pass to break into my house. My fists clenched as I told him to get out, but he just laughed and took another swig of beer. The level of disrespect boiling in my chest was something I had never felt before. He finally stood up, swaggering like he owned the place, and as he walked past me he muttered something about coming back whenever he felt like it. The next morning, I went straight to Karen's house to confront her about what happened. She didn't even open the door all the way. She stood there with her arms crossed and told me that her son was just checking in on the property because I was gone so often. I could feel my blood pressure rise as I explained that checking in on the property didn't involve drinking my beer and leaving muddy tracks all over my floor. Karen's expression never changed. In fact, she seemed annoyed that I was even bringing it up. She said I should be grateful that her son was willing to look after things and that maybe I should give him a spare key next time I travel. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with people who had no respect for personal boundaries. I spent the next week adding security cameras around the house, changing my locks, and installing a new alarm system. I wanted to make sure that if Karen's son ever tried something like that again, I'd have evidence. For a few days, things were quiet. I started to think maybe he had gotten the message. But one night, around midnight, my phone buzzed with a notification from my security system. Someone was on my property. I pulled up the live camera feed and saw the same guy climbing through my back window like he had done it 100 times before. My blood ran cold. I didn't hesitate. I called the police and told them exactly what was happening. Within 10 minutes, I heard sirens and saw flashing lights outside my house. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher until the officers arrived. They stormed into the house and caught Karen's son in my living room, halfway through going through my drawers. He had no excuse this time, no beer, no smirk, just a look of pure shock when the cops grabbed him and shoved him against the wall. As they put him in handcuffs, I heard him shouting that his mom was the HOA president and that she'd have him out by morning. The officers didn't even flinch. They read him his rights and walked him straight to the squad car. When Karen showed up at my house 20 minutes later, she was furious. She started yelling at the officers, demanding that they let her son go and claiming that this was all a misunderstanding. The officer stayed calm as he explained that her son had broken into my house twice and that this was no longer an HOA matter, this was a criminal case. I stood there silently, arms crossed, watching her face turn red as she realized she couldn't control the situation. For the first time since I moved in, I saw Karen lose her composure. She threatened to take me to court, to have me kicked out of the neighborhood, but none of it mattered anymore. Her son was already in the back of the police car, and the evidence was all on my security cameras. That night, after the police left, I sat down on my couch and finally let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I knew the battle with Karen wasn't over, but I also knew I had taken the first step in standing up for myself. This was my house, my property, and no one, no HOA, no neighbor, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, was going to scare me out of it. The morning after her son was hauled off to jail, the entire neighborhood seemed to buzz with tension. I could feel it the moment I stepped outside to grab the paper. People were peeking through blinds, whispering to each other from across the street, pretending to be out for morning walks just so they could glance at my house. I ignored them, but I could feel the judgment, the curiosity, the silent questions hanging in the air. By noon, the HOA had sent me an email calling an emergency meeting that very evening to discuss what they referred to as a serious community incident. I knew before even opening the message that this was Karen's doing. I wasn't about to let them paint me as the villain in this situation, so I gathered everything I had, the security footage, my police report, even the muddy footprints I hadn't cleaned off the floor yet. I wanted to be ready for whatever circus Karen was about to put on. When I walked into the community clubhouse that night, I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the long table like she was royalty. Her expression was stone cold, but there was a fire in her eyes. The other board members sat beside her, some looking uncomfortable, others looking eager to see some drama unfold. The meeting started with Karen launching into a long speech about protecting the harmony of our neighborhood and ensuring that residents respect one another's property. The irony almost made me laugh. She then said that what happened at my house had embarrassed the community and caused unnecessary conflict, and that she believed the matter should have been handled internally through the HOA rather than involving law enforcement. That was when I stood up and put an end to her little performance. I played the security footage on the projector screen for everyone to see. There was her son, climbing through my window, rummaging through my drawers, completely busted on camera. You could hear him muttering to himself about how he owned this place because of his mom. The room went silent. Karen's face turned red, but I kept going. I showed them the police report, detailed everything that had happened, and made it very clear that I wasn't going to be intimidated into dropping the charges. If any of you think this is just a misunderstanding, I said, you're welcome to come look at the damage to my house and explain to me how breaking and entering is just a community issue. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. A few even nodded, clearly agreeing with me. Karen tried to regain control, insisting that I was overreacting, but the evidence was too strong. The meeting ended with no action taken against me, but I could tell this wasn't over. Karen stormed out without saying a word to me, which almost made me smile. The next few days were brutal. Karen had clearly made it her mission to make my life as miserable as possible. I started receiving violation notices for ridiculous things, my trash can being left out for an extra hour, my lawn being too long, even though I had mowed it the day before, a claim that my dog barked too much even though I was home most of the day and knew that wasn't true. It was obvious that Karen was weaponizing the HOA rules against me. Instead of losing my temper, I started documenting everything. I took photos of my lawn right after mowing it, recorded the times I brought my trash in, and even set up an extra camera in my yard to catch anyone trying to tamper with my property. I wasn't going to give them an inch. Then came the day I got a letter from the HOA threatening to fine me for creating an unsafe environment in the neighborhood because of unnecessary police activity. That was the last straw. I called my attorney and had him draft a formal response stating that if they continued harassing me or retaliating against me for reporting a crime, I would be suing the HOA and every board member personally for harassment and violation of homeowner rights. I CC'd the entire neighborhood on that email. The very next morning, Karen was back on my property, not her son this time, but Karen herself. She stood at the edge of my driveway, yelling loud enough for the whole block to hear about how I was ruining the community and destroying her family. I walked outside calmly, phone in hand, recording every second of it. When she saw the camera, she turned red again and stormed off. That video ended up being shared around the neighborhood by a few of the board members who were secretly fed up with her, and soon enough, the tide started to turn. One of my neighbors, a quiet older man who had lived there for years, came over that evening and told me that Karen had been pulling this kind of stunt on other people for years, but no one had ever stood up to her before. He thanked me for not backing down. It felt good to know that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't just me being difficult. Karen had been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for too long, and now her power was starting to crack. The best part came a week later when I got a call from the sheriff's office. They informed me that Karen's son had not only been charged with trespassing and breaking and entering, but that investigators had linked him to a string of other petty thefts around the neighborhood, stolen packages, missing garden tools, even a neighbor's bike that had vanished months ago. The evidence from my cameras had opened up a whole case against him. When I heard that, I couldn't help but smile. Karen tried one last time to intimidate me. She showed up with a clipboard, pretending to do an official HOA inspection of my house. I let her walk around the property while my cameras recorded everything. She wrote down a list of nonsense violations and handed it to me with a smug look. I took the paper, smiled, and handed her a copy of the letter from my lawyer threatening legal action. The smug look disappeared instantly. She left without saying a word. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the sunset, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, peace. The neighborhood was quiet. No yelling, no fake inspections, no entitled intrusions. I knew Karen wasn't done for good, but I also knew she had finally been put in her place. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like this was truly my home. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had completely changed. The once tight grip Karen had over everyone was starting to loosen. I could tell by the way people looked at me when I drove past, nodding and giving me small, knowing smiles. A few even stopped me when I was out walking my dog to say they had seen the security footage and that they were on my side. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory. Karen had spent years building her reputation as the neighborhood enforcer, and now the cracks in her perfect facade were showing. When I walked into the clubhouse for the meeting, there was a different energy in the room. Karen was there, of course, sitting at the head of the table with her usual air of superiority, but she didn't look as confident as she used to. Her son's arrest had rattled her, and it showed. The board members were whispering to each other, exchanging glances, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. The meeting began with a few routine items, but everyone knew why we were really there. One of the board members, a woman named Lisa who had always seemed a bit hesitant to speak up, finally broke the silence. She said that after reviewing the evidence and hearing from multiple neighbors, it was clear that Karen's son's actions had put the entire neighborhood at risk. She suggested that the HOA should issue a formal apology to me and publicly distance themselves from Karen's son's behavior. The room went quiet, and Karen's face turned the deepest shade of red I had ever seen. Karen exploded, slamming her hand on the table and shouting that the HOA board had no right to humiliate her family like that. She claimed that this was all a personal vendetta against her and that I had manipulated everyone into turning against her. But this time, her outburst didn't silence the room. Instead, several board members pushed back, saying that it wasn't about her, it was about keeping the community safe. It was the first time I had ever seen anyone openly defy Karen in a meeting, and it felt like watching a dam finally burst. After the meeting, I started noticing more neighbors speaking up about their own experiences with Karen. One woman told me that Karen had fined her 3 times in a single month for having improperly colored flowers in her front yard. Another man said that Karen had threatened to tow his car for parking in his own driveway overnight because it ruined the aesthetic. Story after story poured out, and it became clear that Karen's reign of terror had gone on for far too long. Meanwhile, Karen was getting more desperate by the day. She started patrolling the neighborhood at night, taking photos of people's houses, sending out mass emails about declining standards, and even going as far as to follow me in her car whenever I left my house. I caught her sitting at the end of my street more than once, just watching my house with the engine running. It was creepy and unsettling, but I refused to let her see that she was getting to me. Instead, I kept collecting evidence. Every time she followed me, I filmed it. Every email she sent, I saved. Every bogus violation she tried to issue, I documented. I wanted to be ready for whatever final stunt she was planning. And sure enough, it came. One evening, I came home to find a giant notice stapled to my front door, an official HOA eviction notice, claiming that I had violated too many rules and that my membership privileges had been revoked. It was laughable because the HOA didn't have the authority to evict anyone, but I knew what she was trying to do. She wanted to scare me into leaving. Instead of tearing it down in anger, I left the notice on my door, took photos, and sent them to my lawyer. He nearly laughed out loud when he saw it. He told me we had enough to sue not just Karen but the entire HOA board for harassment and abuse of power. That night, I drafted a letter with his help and delivered it to every house in the neighborhood. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about holding Karen accountable for years of bullying, intimidation, and hypocrisy. The response from the neighborhood was overwhelming. People started coming forward with their own stories, some of them going back years. A small group of neighbors organized a petition to remove Karen from the HOA board entirely. By the end of the week, nearly half the neighborhood had signed it. When Karen found out, she completely lost it. She marched up to my porch in the middle of the afternoon, screaming at me in front of everyone. Neighbors came outside to watch as she accused me of destroying the community and turning everyone against her. I didn't say a word. I just stood there with my phone recording her as she ranted and raved. When she realized she was being filmed, she stormed off, shouting that this wasn't over. But the truth was, it was over. Karen's control over the neighborhood had been broken. The petition to remove her reached enough signatures, and the board was forced to call a special election. The night of the vote, the clubhouse was packed with residents. You could feel the tension in the air. When the results were read, the room erupted. Karen was officially voted out as HOA president. She stood there, stunned, unable to process what had just happened. Then she stormed out of the room without a word. The rest of the board announced that they would be reviewing all of the old HOA rules and violations to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. For the first time since I had moved in, I felt a sense of real community, neighbors talking to each other, laughing, smiling, and finally free from Karen's shadow. As I walked home that night, I felt lighter than I had in months. The streetlights seemed brighter, the air felt cleaner, and the neighborhood didn't feel like a prison anymore. I knew there might still be some battles ahead, but for the first time, it felt like we, not Karen, controlled what happened here. Karen's removal from the HOA presidency should have been the end of it, but if I had learned anything by now, it was that Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. Losing her position only seemed to make her more unhinged. She no longer had the HOA as her shield, but that didn't stop her from finding other ways to try to make my life miserable. Within days, she started parking her car right across from my driveway, blocking my line of sight whenever I tried to back out. Sometimes she'd sit there for hours, glaring at my house like she was trying to burn a hole through the walls with her eyes. The first time it happened, I ignored it. The second time, I called the non-emergency police line and reported a suspicious vehicle parked outside my house. By the time the patrol car showed up, Karen had already left, but I made sure to keep a log of every single incident. I knew I would need it later. Then came the vandalism. One morning I woke up to find that someone had thrown eggs all over my garage door and smashed a couple of my flower pots. The security cameras caught a blurry figure in the middle of the night, wearing a hoodie and running off toward Karen's house. I turned the footage over to the police, and though they couldn't positively ID the person, I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen's campaign of harassment escalated day by day. I started finding anonymous notes in my mailbox, childish, threatening little messages telling me to get out and that I didn't belong here. Once, I found a dead plant left on my porch with a note saying, "This is what happens to people who ruin communities." It was creepy, but I refused to let her scare me. Instead, I doubled down on documenting everything. My lawyer advised me to stay calm and keep collecting evidence, because we were getting close to the point where we could file a restraining order. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was just after midnight when I woke to the sound of shattering glass. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the nightstand. My dog was barking like crazy. I ran to the front of the house and saw that someone had thrown a rock through my front window. The security alarm blared, and I immediately called 911. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, sirens wailing. As they inspected the damage, one of the officers spotted something on my camera feed: Karen's car parked down the street just minutes before the rock was thrown. The footage showed someone running toward my house, hurling the rock, then sprinting back to the car. The license plate was visible, and there was no denying who it belonged to. That was the final straw. The officers drove straight to Karen's house and knocked on the door. I stood in my driveway watching from a distance as she came outside, arguing with them, throwing her hands in the air. Eventually, they put her in handcuffs and led her to the squad car. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could imagine. For the first time, she wasn't yelling at me, she was yelling at the people who actually had the power to stop her. The next morning, I went down to the sheriff's office to sign the paperwork for a restraining order. I provided every bit of evidence I had: the videos, the photos, the threatening notes, the rock through the window. The officers took it seriously and assured me they would process it quickly. By the end of the week, a judge had approved a restraining order that legally prohibited Karen from coming within 500 feet of my property. The change was immediate. The constant harassment stopped overnight. No more car parked outside, no more notes, no more late-night prowling. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I slept through the night without waking up to worry about what she might do next. But the fallout didn't stop with Karen. Her son's court case was moving forward, and the prosecutors had gathered enough evidence to pursue felony charges for burglary, vandalism, and theft. I didn't have to testify yet, but I was ready if it came to that. The neighbors who had been victims of his thefts also started speaking up, providing their own evidence and statements. The case against him was ironclad. In the meantime, the HOA board moved quickly to clean up the mess Karen had left behind. They revised their rules to make sure no single person could ever have as much unchecked power as Karen once did. They also began working on a community watch program to make sure everyone felt safe, not controlled, but protected. Neighbors who had once been afraid of speaking out started coming by to introduce themselves, bringing over baked goods, inviting me to neighborhood gatherings. It felt like the entire community had taken a deep breath and was finally starting to heal. And while I appreciated their efforts, I wasn't naive. I knew Karen wouldn't forgive or forget so easily. Sure enough, about a month later, I spotted her from a distance at the grocery store. She saw me too, and for a second I thought she might march over and start screaming again. But then she caught herself, turned around, and walked straight out of the store. Maybe it was the restraining order, maybe it was the fact that her son was still behind bars, but she finally seemed to understand that her time of bullying people was over. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, looking at the repaired window and the freshly painted garage door. My dog lay at my feet, calm for the first time in weeks. I thought about how far things had come, from the first night I found Karen's son in my kitchen to this moment, sitting here in peace. The war wasn't just about one break-in, one kid, or even one angry neighbor. It was about standing up for myself, refusing to be bullied, and reclaiming the life I came here to build. The day of Karen's son's trial finally arrived, and it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I had spent months preparing for this moment with the prosecutors, going over every detail, every video clip, every police report. Walking into the courthouse that morning, I felt an odd mix of nerves and relief. This was it, the final chapter of the nightmare that had started the night I found him sitting in my kitchen drinking my beer. Karen was there too, of course, sitting stiffly in the gallery with her arms crossed and her jaw set tight. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't look at anyone. It was like she had built a wall around herself, a last-ditch attempt to pretend none of this was happening. Her son shuffled into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, looking far less cocky than he had the night the cops pulled him out of my living room. He kept his head down, refusing to meet my eyes. The prosecution laid out the case in meticulous detail. They showed the footage from my security cameras, played the audio of him bragging about how Mom runs the HOA, presented evidence of the stolen items that had been recovered from Karen's garage. Neighbor after neighbor took the stand, testifying about missing packages, vandalism, harassment, all of it tying back to Karen's son. By the time they were done, the courtroom felt heavy with the weight of the truth. Karen's son's attorney tried to argue that he was just misguided, and that this was a case of over-criminalization, but it didn't land. The jury didn't need much time. When they came back with a guilty verdict on all counts, burglary, vandalism, and theft, I felt a rush of vindication. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in county jail, plus restitution to every neighbor he had stolen from. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was justice. Karen didn't stay to hear the sentencing. She got up and stormed out of the courtroom the moment the verdict was read, her heels clicking angrily on the tile floor. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then I remembered the months of harassment, the bogus violations, the threats, the rock through my window. She had enabled her son, defended his behavior, and tried to destroy me for daring to hold him accountable. Whatever sympathy I might have had evaporated. After the trial, something amazing happened. The neighborhood, which had been tense and divided for months, started to come together in a way I never expected. People who had been quiet during the whole ordeal began to speak up, sharing their own stories of dealing with Karen and her son. Some admitted they had been too scared to say anything before, afraid of retaliation. Others said they had felt powerless, like nothing would ever change. Now, with Karen gone from the HOA and her son behind bars, there was a sense of freedom in the air. The HOA board called a special meeting a few weeks later to finalize a new set of bylaws designed to prevent any future abuse of power. They introduced term limits for board members, transparency rules for how fines and violations were issued, and a new appeals process that allowed homeowners to challenge unfair citations. The board even voted to refund several past fines that had been issued under Karen's leadership. It was the kind of reform the neighborhood desperately needed. As for me, life finally went back to normal, or at least, a new version of normal. The constant anxiety that had been hanging over me was gone. I could work in my garage without glancing over my shoulder, take my dog on walks without wondering if Karen's car was following me, sit on my porch without worrying about someone hurling a rock through my window. One evening, a group of neighbors invited me to a community barbecue at the park. I almost didn't go. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I wanted to be around that many people, but I'm glad I did. There was laughter, music, kids running around playing tag. People who had once been strangers were now sharing stories, trading recipes, planning block parties. For the first time, I felt like I was part of a real community, not just a collection of houses connected by a set of rules. At one point during the barbecue, Lisa, the board member who had first spoken up against Karen, came over and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a thank you card signed by nearly every neighbor in the community. For standing up for all of us, the card said. For showing us that we don't have to be afraid. I took the card home and set it on my mantel, right next to the repaired window where the rock had once shattered the glass. It was a reminder of how far things had come, a symbol that sometimes standing up to the loudest bully in the room can change everything, not just for you, but for everyone around you. Weeks later, I saw Karen one last time. She was loading boxes into the back of a moving truck. Word around the neighborhood was that she had sold her house and was leaving town. I stood on my porch, watching silently as the truck pulled away. She never looked in my direction. For the first time since I had moved in, I felt truly, completely at peace. That night, I sat outside under the stars, listening to the crickets and the soft hum of the quiet street. My dog curled up next to me, content. I thought about everything that had happened, the break-in, the police, the courtroom, the fights, the sleepless nights. It had been a war, but I had won. More importantly, the neighborhood had won. And as the cool night air settled around me, I realized that this was what I had been searching for when I bought this house, not just a roof over my head, not just a patch of grass to call my own, but a place where I truly belonged. A place I had fought for, and finally made my own.